afternoon. This is Jacqueline from New York State ASBO. I just want to introduce you today to the webinar. We're doing the Risk Intelligent Finance webinar from NYSER. And I have with me the Executive Director of NYSER, Lee Gavey, and a special guest presenting today. I do want to run through a few things with you. I emailed everybody the presentation earlier, about an hour ago, I believe. If you didn't get it, let me know, and I'll resend it to you. I'll also be sending a couple things after the webinar. If you have a question, you can type it into the chat window, or you can type it into the questions window, and we'll answer those. And also, if you have a question, you can click the Raise My Hand button, and I will unmute you, and you can answer the question. And feel free to answer questions at any time, and I will turn it over to Lee. Take it away.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And once again, thanks to everyone in the audience this afternoon. We're excited to be at the midpoint, you might say, of the five-part series. This is number 3, and we have 2 more that'll be following this. Today's session takes a little bit different turn from the first 2 and gets into a topic that I think many school business officials have probably heard something about, but may not have seen the level of discussion or heard what we're going to try to get into this afternoon. This is a topic that I think gets tossed around quite a bit, and today's presentation will feature someone who has experienced top level of a school district's risk management program, who has dealt with the total cost of risk from a lot of different angles. And I think you're going to see today something that will be maybe a little different from some other presentations on this topic. I remember a couple of years back, the ASBO International had a session at their annual conference on this topic, and it was presented by an excellent presenter who did a great job. And I remember that and thinking about this one, how the differences would be. And if you happen to have seen that one, maybe you can share your thoughts afterwards about what you thought was different or unique about the two approaches to this topic. Interestingly enough, there is another organization similar to ASBO on a national level for the university risk managers that has also done quite a lot of work on helping higher education professionals determine their total cost of risk and use that as part of a benchmarking process. Today we won't talk so much about that possibility, but that is one way that the total cost of risk is used in comparing risk management cost or comparing peers. What we're going to do today is ask Jeff Marshall, our special guest, to go through the slides and his presentation. I'm going to interrupt him a little bit today and ask you all to participate in one part, 2 questions. And I believe Jacqueline will actually send out in advance, or maybe following this presentation, the questions. They're very straightforward, I think, but they may cause you to scratch your head and maybe even do a little pencil work. And then we'd like you to, if you could, to send your answers to Matt Darius at ASBO to see what kind of results we get. And maybe this will be something for a future webinar, or possibly a little article, or maybe just something that the Executive Director of ASBO might want to mention. I won't go into all that, but I just want to preview that for you, and also, again, encourage you to submit questions to Jacqueline throughout the webinar, and we'll try to stop and answer those questions for you. As you may have heard, Jeff Marshall has served as the risk manager for the City of Philadelphia schools, public schools, for a number of years. Prior to that, he had served in the state of New Jersey as a claims manager for the state. He has a degree in law. He's got a background in teaching at the higher ed level with some risk management courses. And Jeff has done some things in small town government. Some of you may have heard me say he's been a mayor. So Jeff's covered a lot of territory over his career and has a wide knowledge of public education and the issues that are facing us in terms of how we become risk intelligent. Jeff, I'm going to turn it over to you, and then I'll jump in around 25. If you remember, that was my lead in, about slide 25 or something like that. We've got a lot of slides that I think you'll see they're going to move pretty quickly. So Jeff, it's all yours.
Thank you. Yeah, I like to think that I've covered a lot of ground. My wife tells me that I've got ADHD, and that's why I keep covering so much ground. For those of you who have been to our prior webinars, I view those really as the parsley on the plate. Today's stuff is what I consider as the real meat and potatoes of risk management. I usually don't like reading my slides, but I do want to read the first slide if I can get my computer. Actually, my computer is acting up here. Why is it not changing? Hold on, folks. Okay, wait. I think we've got a technical issue here. Let me just see what's going on here. Let's try this again. I'm very sorry about this. So let's see if this will get it to go. Oh, okay. I want to read this first one so that way everybody can appreciate what is at stake. When a first grade teacher, oh, hold on a second, we're having some technical problems here. Okay, I'm unable to, I'm sorry about this, I'm unable to get the, this is work. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, we got the slide.
I can put it on my computer and we can,
hold on, let me, okay. Anyways, this first slide, from what I understand, everybody has a copy of the presentation. This first slide sums up the total cost of risk in a nutshell. If you walk away with nothing else, this is the slide that sums it up. It's basically that when a first grade teacher gets injured and is out for 15 weeks, her students are going to go through a series of substitute teachers. They're going to be denied the opportunity to learn their basic reading, spelling, and mathematics. For them, the battle was over before it ever began because they missed their basics. While everybody else learned their basics, these kids were spending time with crayons and blank pieces of paper. When they get reintegrated into a second grade class with kids who did get a full education, they start feeling incredibly inadequate and start losing their self-esteem. We measure our failure rates by our dropout rates, by our low scores in high school. But really, the total cost of risk is when we lost those teachers at the front end, we lost our students. That's the total cost of risk. So if you could take a few moments to read this afterwards, I'd be most appreciative. This is what you need to understand for total cost of risk. Everything else explains how we get there. Okay, and
okay, do you want me to take over?
Yeah, hold on. Let me just, one other thing I can try here. Okay.
Hit the arrows at the bottom. You got it? Okay.
I think I've got it again. Okay, what we're going to do, we're going to quickly define risk. Then we're going to look at how do you prioritize risk, because there's just too much out there. I'm going to teach you the basics of risk mapping so that you can understand how to deal with your risks. And then we're going to look at the 4 tools of risk. I want to then spend time talking about your risk appetite. And when I say your risk appetite, I mean very personal to each of the participants here, because everybody has a different risk appetite. Once you start understanding that, I'd like to spend the closing moment going through the total cost of risk by looking at different exercises on how to understand the total cost of risk and then how to influence that total cost of risk using your risk tools. So to start with, those of you who have not been to the earlier 2 webinars, could you just take a moment very quickly, no more than 10 seconds, write down your definition of risk.
I did it in 2 seconds, Jeff. It was uncertainty.
Okay, now, for those who haven't been around, risk, as Lee just said, he said that it was uncertainty. Most people say that it is a chance of injury or loss. They define it as a hazard. What Lee just said was uncertainty. What uncertainty is that it implies that you could have upside risk as well, not just downside risk. A good example is you're taking the risk of changing a curriculum. You risk seeing lower scores, but you also risk seeing higher scores. That is the key, uncertainty. In that respect, we have two types of risk. You have speculative risk and you have pure risk. Speculative risk is I have upside or downside. Think of the lottery ticket. I spend $5 on a lottery ticket. I could lose those $5, or I could gain $1 million. The risk that most people are familiar with is pure risk, and the best way to think of that is Superstorm Sandy. When Superstorm Sandy hit, you had 5 types of potential losses: catastrophic losses, major losses, moderate losses, minor losses, no losses. That's pure risk. There is no upside to that. Today we're going to be focusing on the pure risk or the downside risk. And the only reason why is because there's so much material to cover, it would double the amount of time if I was showing you upside risk opportunities as well. Now, the thing you need to realize is that there is so much risk out there, you don't have the manpower, you don't have the resources to address all your risks. You've got to find a way of prioritizing your risks. Normally what happens is you start developing a list of risk issues. The risk issues that I'm showing you right now are as diverse as they get, but really some of them are major risks, some of them are minor risks. And it really doesn't matter what order you put them in, because after you put them in some sort of an order, you start looking at the frequency and severity. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about frequency and severity in the next presentation. But for now, what we're going to do is we're just going to plug in some numbers. Once you have your numbers plugged in, as you can see, for instance, on frequency, over here I have the frequency maybe 4 to 6. The reason why is because you may be looking at it year over year and say, some years I don't have a lot of employee injuries, some I have a lot more injuries. You may be defining it, you may be defining it in terms of monthly or seasonally, and you say, you know, in the wintertime I have a lot of problems. In the summertime, not as many. It's okay to have a spread. The same thing with severity. You can have a spread there as well. Once you have these numbers, you can then plug them into your risk map. And that's what your risk map looks like. As you can see here, you have your funding source issue. The risk map doesn't really mean anything to anybody when you look at it in these terms. So if you're not impressed by it, that's okay. You're not supposed to be. But what happens is, once you start colorizing it and start breaking it up into your ranges of risk, it starts taking on some serious meaning. You can start thinking about, what are my greatest risks? What are my secondary risks, my tertiary, and then my lowest of risks? Now this starts to take on some meaning, because as you resort your risk list, your risk inventory, you start to see these are the risks that I really need to be paying attention to. These are the ones that are going to really impact my program, versus something like graffiti at the very bottom, no real impact. So this is why a risk map becomes valuable. Okay, we're having trouble changing here, folks. Give me a second.
Is this where I want to jump in here, Jeff?
Okay.
What Jeff has just given you on the risk map is, as he said, a fundamental tool, and you may not do it exactly the way he does it. There are other forms that are called heat maps, which give the same sort of approach to show what are the hot topics or the hot issues, maybe from the most severe to the lowest. There are other versions of this sort of risk map. Before Jeff goes into this next section, which is going to be an interesting use of the chalkboard, I think you've seen Jeff in previous webinars. If not, you'll know that the chalkboard becomes very helpful for what he's about to do. I just want to introduce one practical alternative to what Jeff's talked about so far, that some people, when they think about total cost of risk, they immediately think about funding of workers' compensation, which in every district I think is one of those challenges of how do we get our hands around the total cost of workers' compensation. And what I'd like you to do is, for just a moment, think about your workers' compensation program and ask yourself this question: what is the cost that I can see and measure in terms of dollars, maybe your funded workers' comp portion, and what is the cost that you can't easily see or can't easily get your hands around? And I would submit to you that some professionals would refer to the first category as the direct costs, and the second category is the indirect, or maybe even the soft cost. And I want to list those out to you for just a second, and you'll get a slide from Jacqueline later on this that'll give these so you don't have to write them all down here. And then I'd like to close with sort of two questions. But as you think about this, let me mention some of the direct costs, or 5 of those direct costs would be A, premium, then the administration of your plan if you have a third-party administrator. If you're self-insured, that's certainly an element. Or if you're just buying a traditional workers' comp, you might just have a premium. So maybe 1 and 2 are premium and administration. And 3 would be, again, if you're self-insured, you might have a retention for injuries during the current year, the actual losses that you would have to pay during that year. And then in addition to those paid losses, you would have reserves on injuries that occurred during the year. So there's a dollar figure that you can calculate on your injuries for your loss reserves. And then finally, another direct cost would be legal expense that might be either tied to those claims, either from litigation or other parts of the administration in terms of contracts and related parts of the workers' comp program. So there's sort of 5 categories I've given you of direct cost. Then in terms of indirect, maybe the first one that people can think about is the cost of safety itself. What does it take to manage your safety program, to purchase equipment and things related to prevention of injuries? And then more post-injury would be the damage to any property that occurred related to your employee injuries. And then if you go a little further out, you find the loss of productivity, disruption of your operations, the cost of the lost time, something that Jeff was referring to previously when the teacher's out of the classroom. There's that cost to the students, and so how do you measure that? And then cost to hire substitute or overtime labor. And finally, management of the time and expense required to take care of all these things that may not show up in any one particular person's salary, but may be spread out over quite a few people, and there's no tracking of those costs. And I would submit that those indirect costs are part of the total cost of your workers' comp program. So my question that you might want to think about, and if you can take the time and send Matt, Darius an email, would you estimate for us the percentage of your funded workers' compensation to your total cost? In other words, if your direct cost is X and your total cost is Y, what is that percentage of X to Y? So maybe you'll have some number like 50% or 75%, but it'd be very interesting because we hear different professionals speak about the hidden cost of workers' compensation, and I'm not sure that anyone has one right answer to this. And it'd be very interesting if you would send Darius an email just saying, Matt, I think my direct cost is 50% of my total cost, or my direct cost is 75% of my total cost. Just like to see if you wouldn't mind doing that today or when you have a chance. And the second part of that question, which might help ASBO in some of its efforts to understand what's happening in workers' comp, is if you would send Matt what you think is the direct cost of your workers' comp program in terms of your student enrollment or ADA or any other baseline that makes sense for you. But if you could sort of turn that into a cost per student for workers' comp, if you'd send that number, cost per student for workers' comp, to Matt, it'd be very interesting to see what kind of results we get. We might be able to report this back. We're expecting an interesting range to these two questions, A and B. So Matt, I'm going to just leave it there. I know the audience might have questions, and if you want to email Matt or Jacqueline afterwards, we'll try to clarify anything I may have just said, and the slide that you get maybe will help clarify that. So Matt, Jeff, thank you for letting me just do that little side note before you jump into your chalkboard exercise, and maybe the audience will have that little piece of information about workers' comp to think about as they look at the bigger picture of what you're going to go to. So give it back to you.
No problem.
Thank
Just
you.
as a quick aside, in furtherance of your question, some places will track the cost on a per student basis. Over in Philadelphia, I tracked it on the average cost per employee because of the way we funded our program. We were a self-insured program, and so we had to set aside a certain amount of money per employee. And in 2005, we were spending $353 per employee. By 2007, it had moved up. When I came in, it was up to $470 per employee. Now, that doesn't sound overly impressive until you stop to realize the fact that, oh, sorry about this. Let me see if I can figure out how to move this. That doesn't sound particularly impressive until you stop to realize that we're talking of 23,000 employees. And so the number becomes a very mind-boggling number to realize. So you may want to think about measuring it as a cost per employee, if not a cost per student.
And Jeff, that's a very good point, and I didn't want to suggest there's one way to do that either, but that sometimes gets attention when you talk about, the cost per student. But in your case, you're exactly right. Cost of employee is just as good a benchmarking tool. So if you want to do it either way. The audience can do it either way, or both if they could.
A great way to do it is stop and look at your funding source. If you're getting funding based on a per student basis or a per capita basis on your students, then that's the way you want to measure it, to see how much of each dollar of student funding is going to your workers' comp. That starts to put your total cost into perspective, because every dollar you're spending on workers' comp is a dollar that you didn't spend on education. So the method that Lee is promoting is probably going to be a much better system if you are getting per capita funding. Now, as far as understanding total cost of risk, and this reminds me of that commercial that's out there for one of the cable stations where they start doing a doom and gloom scenario. This really explains how to think of cost of risk outside of the dollars and cents issue. When you're looking at property damage, when you're looking at workers' compensation, it becomes easy because you're working with numbers predominantly. But let's talk about a different set of numbers. Your state scores have fallen for the third consecutive year. When something like that happens, the first thing that happens is everybody starts calling for your head. They want to change of administration because if I have a better administration, I'll have better results on test scores. The elected officials, and I can tell you this because I used to be a mayor, the elected officials start trying to use their oversight and their funding powers to influence that change. More importantly, you start seeing colleges saying, I would rather go and take a kid 2 towns over that got a B over the student in your school that got an A because your test scores just aren't very solid. As that starts happening, the elected officials start trying to promote legislation that's going to impact the process. When the new governor of Pennsylvania came in, he was very frustrated with the scores in most of the large cities in Pennsylvania. The test scores were abysmal. Philadelphia had a 40% graduation rate from high school. So what happened was his transition team did not have anybody that I recognized from a public school. Everybody had charter school background, and the charter school movement really got a big boost during that moment because he was talking about the failing test scores. As that happens, as you start having the test scores falling, you start having increased dropout rates. That results in increased crime and decreased property value. If you are set up on a property value-based funding, you're seeing your funding dropping off, and you start seeing funding getting diverted to address crime issues instead of education issues. That starts the ball going down the hill faster as you start seeing reduction in programs due to lack of funds. You start seeing reduction in teachers, reduction in resources. In the case of Philadelphia, Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, you're seeing closings of schools. We just closed another 24 schools in Philadelphia. Now, that's not to say that if you're a small school district, you're immune. It just means that the media only reports the big failures. As you start closing schools, you start seeing increased class size. That's going to start impacting your actual education process. Teachers are going to start getting very frustrated. They're going to start leaving because they don't have the resources. As that's happening, you now have to spend more money to attract teachers, and that takes away again from your programs. Of course, as that happens, your test scores start to fall again because there's less money going to the teaching process. And this process then keeps spiraling over and over and over again. And that's what we look at when we're thinking in terms of the total risk of cost. It's not just the dollars. It's the impact that these dollars are having. I want to go back to the process of risk appetite. And I'm starting off with that risk map. You don't need to know what the A versus G is. That's a balanced risk map. Everybody has a different risk appetite. If you have a risk appetite for a higher amount of risk, you'll notice that the red zone becomes smaller. You say there's very few truly high risks. There's a lot more low risk that we just blow out of proportion. If you look at the difference in the risk maps, I is no longer considered a medium risk. If you're looking, you may now say J is no longer a high risk. It should be a lower risk. And by the way, Lee had said that we also use what's called a heat map, which is not these 4 zones the way it's broken out. It's a little bit different, but this is the simplest form. But as you can see, my true risks are a lot smaller. My big risks are a lot smaller. My small risks are a lot larger. If you have a lower appetite for risk, the lines, the colors shift the other way. And I used more of a heat map approach, as you can see with with H and I with the red and the orange. This becomes more of a heat map. But suddenly you have more things that are in the high range. It means also that you have more things that are on your front burner to address. No matter how you define your risks, once you've identified them, there's only 4 methods to address those risks. I don't care if the risk is launching a spaceship, running a fast food restaurant, or running a school district. They're all the same. I'm going to go through them, list them, because we have to compare them against each other. The first one is risk acceptance, risk mitigation, risk transfer, and risk avoidance. So going through them, our first one is risk acceptance. Very simply, I can afford to accept the consequences of my risk. If I do something wrong and it blows up in my face, it's not so bad. I use this if the risk is small enough that I can absorb the risk. I don't have to spend money on mitigation strategies. I don't have to try to transfer the risk and spend money. And I certainly don't have to avoid the action as a way of avoiding the risk. So with that in mind, let's see, there's 2 types of risk acceptance. The first risk acceptance is the intentional acceptance of risk. Think about your own personal car. If you have collision insurance, you've already decided that I'm willing to take the first $100 of loss, or I'm willing to take the first $1,000 of loss, or the first $5,000. You're making a determination of how much risk can you hold on to. Another way of thinking of it is, in your community, you may have the only baseball field in your community. You may have the only outdoor basketball court, or the only gym set, swing set, etc. And so you decide that for public relations purposes, and since the law is on my side as far as injuries on public property, I'm not going to lock up the schoolyard at the end of the school day. It'll be available to the community. The scary one is the unintentional acceptance of risk. When you forget to buy your insurance, to renew your insurance, and the next thing you know, you have a loss and there's no insurance there. Or you forget to renew your service contract on your photocopier, and you get a sudden electrical spike and it fries all of your photocopiers. You've now accepted that risk, but you didn't intend on doing it. The next risk technique is risk mitigation. Very simply, we understand that airplanes are now weapons of mass destruction. We understand that they are great hostage camps if I want to take hostages. So we need to learn to change our behaviors to lessen the impact of risk. That's risk mitigation. Another good example, cholesterol runs in my family. I know that I'm destined to have a cholesterol heart attack. My mitigation strategy is I cut out the red meat. I cut out the ice cream. I increase my exercising. I take medication. I change my behaviors to lessen my impact. You do these things when you realize that the inevitable consequence of risk, if realized, is too big to absorb. My family can't take a hit if I have a heart attack. It's unavoidable. I can't just say, no, I'm not having a heart attack. And there's no way to transfer in that particular case, or maybe too expensive. The insurance would be too expensive. That's when risk mitigation comes into play. Using metal detectors at your school to detect weapons, that's risk mitigation. Doing constant safety inspections of your buses, your sports equipment, cafeteria equipment, that's risk mitigation. Backing up your data off-site, that's risk mitigation. To me, the best risk mitigation program or process is developing a risk management program. And in the next webinar, we're going to be talking about the fact that if you're a school with 360 students, if you're a school with 2,000 students, you may not be able to afford a full-time risk manager. I was just talking to a major school district of 19,000 students that does not have a risk manager. They're not big enough to have a risk manager, but they want to have a risk management program. That's your best mitigation tool. Risk transfer. This is the one that gets overused. It's the act of shifting the burden of risk or benefit to a third party. The classic is insurance. Again, going back to my health issue, if I have a heart attack, I couldn't afford my medical bills. I'm transferring the risk to my health insurance carrier. I couldn't afford to buy a new house, so I'm transferring it to my property and casualty insurance company. Whenever you transfer risk, there's two elements of risk acceptance. The first risk acceptance is the insurance company has accepted my risk. The second risk acceptance is the deductible. How much am I willing to keep? The more risk I'm willing to keep, the cheaper the risk transfer will be. And we're going to explore that in a few seconds. You use it when you can't afford to accept the risk. Mitigation strategies are either incomplete or aren't acceptable. That doesn't cover everything, and you can't avoid the risk. The way that you avoid the risks inherent to running a school is to close down the school. That's obviously not an acceptable response, and so that's why you look at risk transfer. Besides the insurance issue, think about your transportation. You may decide that the risks and costs inherent to transportation are too expensive, and so you contact First Student or some other transportation organization to do it for you. You may decide that with food allergies and all the other issues of making sure that the food arrives on time, that it's prepared properly, you're not built to handle those risks. You transfer your risk to a food service like Aramark, let's say. The mistake that people do is that they think that insurance is a hammock, not a safety net. there's a whole philosophy on how you go and acquire your insurance, and the argument is it's the very last step. But without going over to there, I just want you to think for a moment. You have a school, the school and the contents of the school are $30 million. As you start thinking about insurance, you need to ask, do I want to insure the building? In Philadelphia, we've decided not to insure certain buildings because if the building burns down, we've got all these other buildings that are mothballed. We can just open one up real fast. We've decided not to insure the buildings that have been closed and have been mothballed because we're not going to replace them. Why buy the insurance? You need to think about the self-insured retention. How much can I afford per loss? So if I have 10 losses that year and I have a $500,000 retention, I'm going to have to come up with $5 million. You need to think about that as you're talking about your insurance or your risk transfer. You need to think about what your limits are going to be. You even need to think about what type of insurance company do you want. You want a traditional insurance, let's say like AIG. Remember, AIG almost failed. It had to be bailed out. You want a mutual organization like Atlantic Mutual. They're not around anymore. They went belly up. Perhaps a joint insurance fund. Think in terms, NICER is one. Do you want to self-insure like the school district of Philadelphia? You want to set up a captive. There's all these different issues that you need to think about. Insurance is not a hammock, folks. As you start to look at the insurance issues, you start to see how it's going to fit into the total cost of risk. Because what happens is you start looking at, maybe I can drive the price of my insurance down. If I have a self-insured portfolio of $200 million, and by the way, that's about the midpoint for all of the participants in NICER. If you have a $200 million portfolio and your self-insured retention, or SIR, is $250,000, think of an SIR as a deductible. It really isn't, but it's close enough that we can take liberties here. These are the numbers that you're looking at. You've got a premium of $200,000. If, however, you decide to change a little bit and raise your SIR, your insurance rates will come down, and therefore your premiums will come down. It may fit your budget a little better. Change your SIR a little bit more, and the next thing you know, the insurance rates are going to go down even further. Change your limits, and you can drive it down even further. The problem is you've saved $65,000, but do you have enough money to cover your potential losses? The only way you're ever going to know that is that you need to sit down and start thinking about the types of claims that you're having, how much it would have cost you at each deductible level, the types of property claims, the annual costs of property claims, the average cost of types of property claims. Insurance isn't an easy game, folks. The other risk management tools are a whole lot easier. It brings us to our fourth tool. The fourth is risk avoidance. Just say no. It's the Nancy Reagan School of Risk Management. It's defined as eliminating the risk by changing your goals. Perhaps it's just too expensive or too dangerous to take on that risk, and we have to walk away from it. It's used when the risk is too great, your mitigation techniques are inadequate or unreasonably priced, the risk transfer is unreasonably priced, there's no other opportunity available, or it's just too expensive. Here's a couple of examples. Closing schools ahead of a bad storm. Prohibiting student parking on your school property. Eliminating behind-the-wheel driver's ed, and prohibiting in-school bake sales has become the new one because of all of the allergies that are out there. I want to take a moment to show how you don't use just one of these techniques, but rather you employ as many of them as possible. Think in terms of the bad snowstorm that's going to hit midday. First off, as a risk acceptance policy, you're willing to open up the school for a number of different reasons, so you're going to open it for a half day. Well, if you open it up for a half day and then send all the kids home in the middle of a blizzard, you may have some kid whose parents are at work and aren't home to receive their kid, and you have a first grader standing in a blizzard. So your risk mitigation strategy, based on the acceptance strategy, your risk mitigation strategy is to notify the community of the midday closing, get snow and ice removal equipment ready, so if the storm starts a little early, you have good ingress and egress, get your transportation lined up. One other one that people forget is coordinate your food services. Many communities are just too poor for the kids to be getting their proper nutrition. When the schools are closed, they don't get to eat. Part of your mitigation strategy, include that. Your risk transfer has already been taken care of in purchasing your workers' comp, purchasing your property insurance. Risk avoidance would be canceling after-school activities. So now you see very quickly how you would mix these all together. With that in mind, if you take the midday storm again, I gave you the balanced approach. If you are more risk adverse, that means that you don't like the risk. You're not going to accept the risk. Instead, you're going to jump down to the bottom where it says risk avoidance the day before you're announcing no school tomorrow because of the impending storm. On the other hand, if you're less risk adverse, you're going to open up the school. You're not going to do the avoidance. If you are the more risk adverse, you're going to have snow equipment ready to clear everything so that the kids can get out. Or excuse me, if you're more risk adverse, you're going to have your snow equipment ready so as soon as the storm stops, you can clear the walks and clear the driveway. If you're less risk adverse, you're going to have that same mitigation strategy so that way people can get in and out of the building. So now you start to see how, with your different risk appetites, you can approach your tools. And so at this point, what I'd like to do is give you 3 examples. One is going to be number-oriented. The others are going to be more policy to see how total cost of risk, specifically total cost of risk, plays out and how you would address them. The first one is the snow removal. Now, as far as snow removal, and I'm just going to make one change here if you don't mind. Oh, snow. Sorry about that. The consequences of snow removal or no snow removal, slip and fall injuries to your staff, employee vehicle sliding into another employee vehicle, district-owned vehicle sliding into an employee vehicle or vice versa, and also, of course, kids falling, but I decided not to put that in for right now. If you look at the slip and fall, you have your hard costs. You have medical costs, legal fees, wage continuation, increased insurance rates, the cost of a replacement teacher. You have your soft costs, administrative time and costs. And then you have your hidden costs. As you can see, the hidden costs are where your real costs are. The impact to your test scores, the long-term impact to students who aren't prepared to go on to college or a vocational school. As far as an employee sliding into another employee's vehicle, you probably don't have any hard or soft costs, but perhaps if they decide to name you in the suit because you should have maintained the parking area, you could end up with legal fees. But what happens is your hidden cost is the teacher who would have spent their prep time working with a student or prepping is now on their cell phone trying to get their insurance worked out or trying to get their car repaired. District vehicles, same situation. You will have expenses of repairing your vehicle. You may have the expenses of repairing the employee's vehicle. And even if not, you're losing the use of your employee as they're trying to resolve their own problem. With that in mind, you start looking at your mitigation strategies. or your risk management tools. The transfer took place when you bought insurance, so that one I didn't go into. But as far as risk mitigation, for the $500 it would have cost you to clear your parking lot, you could have avoided, or you could have lowered the risk. You can't completely, but you would have lowered your risk. Your risk acceptance strategy may be, well, we self-insure, or we have a large self-insured retention, and for everybody who gets hurt or for every piece of property, we're budgeting for that. If you're a smaller school district, that's not going to be able to fit into your budget very well. Even a mid-sized school district may have troubles with that. So a risk acceptance strategy may not be the strategy for you. Risk avoidance. Close the parking area. It'll cost you the price of a lock and chain to put it across the entranceway with a sign, closed. That's avoiding the risk altogether. Here's another one. The total cost of risk of changing curriculum. I don't know if any of you have ever tried doing it. If so, you know just what a nightmare it is. The hard costs are you have to explore the costs of the actual changeover to determine what are my alternative curriculum. You're going to have to buy new course material. You're going to have to train your teachers. But on top of that, you have to start educating the public as to the change. Otherwise, they're going to be up in arms when their kids come home with a new book and a new method of teaching a curriculum. And inevitably, you get somebody who decides to sue you because of the change, and so you're going to have legal costs. You have your hidden costs. You have teachers who have been teaching with one method for 10 years, 20 years. They don't want to participate in the change. They're going to leave. You may have union resistance resulting in a strike. That's going to be increased substitutes and possibly more legal fees. But you have some very good upside consequences. This is the time that you say, I want to accept the risk because what I stand to gain is so important. And it creates a new hidden cost. On the flip side, you have an extreme downside risk presenting itself. What happens if the new curriculum results in lower test scores? And this is something you need to stop and weigh as you're proceeding. Well, now that you've defined your risks, now that you understand the total cost of the risk that you're about to take on, now you can start planning your strategy on how to deal with that total cost of risk. First off, risk acceptance strategy can only occur, accepting this risk can only occur when you do other activities. For instance, your mitigation strategy, you want to research all your options, you want to work with your stakeholders to make sure that you're getting buy-in. You want to say to yourself, do I have enough money to see this through? And set up a metrics or an auditing process. Perhaps you may say, I only want to do a pilot program. Perhaps I want to have an outside organization auditing it every step of the way. You then have risk transfer strategy. That is, have third parties develop and implement either first off, you have an outside organization do the research for you as to what curriculum would be best and have them make the recommendations. Perhaps have a third party implementing, including training your teachers. Risk avoidance strategy is none. You're either going to do the change or you're not going to do the change. It's that simple. The last one, and if you've noticed, each time the way we've approached the risk has been different, but we get to cover every point. It's circular, so it really depends where do you want to jump in on it. The last example I want to give you is the total cost of risk of school funding. I don't have to tell you the consequences of decreased funding or increased funding means you're either going to have to cut back or increase your programs, cut back or increase your employees or their benefits, cut back or increase on how you're going to maintain your facilities or even putting in new facilities. That's the consequences of the risk that you're facing. Your hard and soft costs are, one, hiring a lobbyist to try to make sure that you get what you're trying to get. Perhaps if you have to go directly to your municipality to get funding from the municipality, have community outreach programs. For instance, one community it's the community that I was the mayor in, we knew we were going to have a particularly difficult year passing our budget. The seniors were pushing very hard against it. What we developed was a program where we had students going out into the senior community and working with seniors and also providing opportunities for seniors to get additional education through our high school. So that way we could get a better outreach to them and a better consequence. Those are your hard costs and your soft costs. Your hidden costs is all the administrative time and all the community relationship impacts that take place. Once you have this understanding, you can start looking at your different strategies. As you can see, risk strategy of acceptance is just do your best, give it your best fight, and see what happens. Probably is naive at best. A risk mitigation strategy is to hire the lobbyist, have a plan B or a doomsday budget ready, so that way you don't miss a beat. If things go bad, you're ready to proceed with a lower budget. Start looking at community partnership programs. Perhaps you can turn to the community, to businesses to help fill in some of the gaps where you lose your funding. Risk avoidance strategy, there is none. Risk transfer, there is none. So realistically, what you are looking at is you're having to live with just the one strategy, risk mitigation. I'm hoping that what this has done has shown you that there are tools to be used. There are tools that you have been using even though you hadn't defined them. The problem is until you understand your risks and the total cost of the risk, the total impact of that risk, you really can't apply the tools in any fashion that has a total impact. So hopefully that is what you've gotten out of this today. And at this point, I would like to open up to questions.
Jeff, I've got one question, but I'm going to hold it just a second, see if we have some others that someone emailed us during the presentation. So
okay.
If others have some questions they want to send to Jacqueline. All right, well, let me just pose this one to you. And I think this may be one of those that's kind of hard to answer, but the question comes from the audience. What benefit or advantage business officials receive from highlighting the total cost of risk? I think you just answered that, but could you just maybe reinforce what the benefit of doing this total cost of risk process or exercise is?
It comes in at two different levels. The first level is as a business officer, once you understand the total cost of risk, you at the highest level can start making decisions of how should we handle particular risks. You're setting the tone. For those who weren't here for the earlier webinars, the business office, the superintendent's office, the board of ed, they're setting the tone for everybody else. And so they need to have people understand that when you make this decision, for instance, the total cost of risk, you want to spend time in your high school chemistry department. You tell them, I want you to spend the time to go through all your chemicals, make sure they're all properly labeled, all properly packaged. I want the acids on one side of the room. I want the alkalis on another side, on the opposite side of the room. Now, that doesn't sound all that brilliant, but traditionally what happens is chemistry teachers would line up all their chemicals alphabetically, so that way it was easy to find them. And if you have an acid leaking and an alkali leaking, you've got a significant problem. So you say, look, this is what I want done. I want to mitigate that risk. I want all chemistry classes or all chemistry teachers to take this activity now. You can tell them that, and they'll probably follow your lead because you signed their paycheck. But better is to say to them, the reason we're doing this is that there is a substantial hazard being presented. And the time that we take, we eliminate having somebody suffer a chemical burn. We eliminate having to evacuate a school or possibly have a fire by doing this. You think it's just separating the chemicals. I think it's saving the schools. So you're making that decision as a business officer, but where the rubber meets the road, where the program is playing out, they need to understand it as well. Because once they start seeing or dealing with total cost of risk, they start seeing their attitudes change to think about, when I'm running my gym class, that rope doesn't look like it's been checked in a while. I think I'm going to pass on having kids climb ropes. You start making decisions like that because where the rubber meets the road, they start thinking in terms of total cost of risk. They start thinking about what is the impact, the real impact of my decision, not just the financial impact of my decision.
So a lot of what you've done, it seems pretty obvious to experienced business officials probably, and as I sat here I thought, wow, this is pretty basic. But if you're able to make this clearer to someone else who may not be at the same level, this creates that risk intelligence we've been talking about. Is that kind of what you see here? Is this a communication tool to get it across?
Oh, sorry.
Yes, I mean, I don't know if that's a question or a statement, but.
Well, if I may, we had a situation where the school district of Philadelphia shied away from international trips. They actually even shied away from trips outside of Philadelphia. Looking at risk, there's a lot of downside risk there, but there's a tremendous amount of upside risk to taking students outside of the classroom, especially outside of the environment that they know. So what we did was we put together a course on travel risk management for the students who are going to be going. And one of the things that I talked to them about is not wanting to stand out. You want to be just another zebra in the pack. And it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to students who are fashion conscious. I showed a video that I got from YouTube of a woman dressed in traditional Muslim garb walking up the street, and you see her get attacked from behind for no other reason than how she was dressed. And she was dressed incredibly modestly. It wasn't like she was looking like she was walking the streets for money. And you see her get hit from behind and just go down like a tree being subject to an axe. And after I stopped it, all the students just sat silent. They didn't know what to say. They suddenly realized what the risk was of trying to stand out when you're not in a familiar area. So they came to understand, at the very lowest level, they came to understand why risk mattered, and what the total risk was that was being presented by their choice of clothing. So it plays out on two different levels.
Okay. Jacqueline, we're coming up on the hour. In fact, I think it's been 60 minutes since we started this conversation. And I'm not seeing any more chat. Are you finding any questions out there?
Does anybody have any questions? You can hit the raise my hand button, and I can unmute you if you have a question. We'll give you a minute to hit it, or you can stick it in the chat. I externally chatted everybody instead of just the organizers. Or in the questions panel.
Can I just put in a little comment here, and then maybe if Jeff wants to have the final word, unless we get another question, we'll be signing off. This is the third session, and the fourth one is next, let's see, 1 week from today on the 26th of September, we will reconvene. The topic or the title is Helping Others, 8 Essential Practices of the Risk Intelligent School Business Official. And it's going to feel like we're going to pull together a lot from the first three sessions, I think. Maybe Jeff and I are going to come up with some other ways to present this, whether the chalkboard that you've seen or something else that you can use as a communication tool. But the emphasis will be on sort of the outreach. Now we've hopefully prepared you in some ways, and then, again, how do we help others become risk intelligent? That's number 4, and then number 5 will be October the 2nd. I won't go into all the details, but we sort of titled it Success Factors, and we'll leave that to you for you to be thinking about. But we are real thankful for everyone's time and attention today. Jeff, anything else you want to say?
Just thank you to everybody for helping out with getting this presentation put together, and thank you for everybody for listening in. I hope that this has been helpful to you.
So if you get a chance, send an email to Matt Darius. Thank you again, Jacqueline, for helping us today.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for presenting today. I'm sure this information is very useful to everybody. If anybody doesn't have any questions, if they do, send us an email and we'll send them on to Jeff and Lee and we'll get them going. If not, we'll see you next time. And thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.